So I'm going to share with you a recipe that was always a favorite of mine growing up. And once again, this isn't a so-called formal recipe because I just make things from scratch and as I remember them and as it looks right and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm going to share with you my recipe for fry bread. And for fry bread, there are a couple different ways you can make it. You can use baking powder. You can use yeast, you can use both. You do kind of want somewhat of a leavening agent to get those nice little bubbles in the fry bread. If you're in a hurry though, I like to use both, a little bit of yeast and a little bit of baking powder. So there was actually a time when I made fry bread for 500 kids for a school assembly that was focused on Native American heritage, and I cooked with my friend Antonia, who's Navajo, and we made so much fry bread. My entire house was like just smelled like fry bread. So anyways, it's a delicious treat. It's also something that you can just lean on for a staple from week to week as well. It's very satisfying. It's something that is great to eat with soups, hint, hint, because the recipe I just posted of my hearty vegetable soup would go amazing with fry bread and a little bit of butter. So this is my fry bread recipe. First, you're gonna start with just the basic yeast and water. So you've got a bowl. I've got water that, again, like it's a cup of water that to your wrist should feel slightly warm. So you don't want it too hot. You don't want cold water. I don't like using cold water. I like to give that yeast a little bit of a boost. And then I'm just using 1 packet of yeast. For most of my yeast rolls and breads that I've done videos on before, I like to use 2 packets. But I just use 1 packet for this particular recipe. So we're just gonna whisk up that yeast in the water, and then once it's dissolved and kind of getting started, we're gonna add our other ingredients. So just whisk that yeast in the water until it's completely dissolved. So once that yeast has gotten going, we're going to add a little bit of sugar, not much, just a little dash, maybe 1 or 2 tablespoons. We're also going to be adding some baking powder and a little bit of salt. I just like to make sure it's, lightly salted, probably 3/4 of a teaspoon or so of that. I'm going to add about this much baking powder, which is probably 1.5 teaspoons, I don't know. And then really the only other thing, and you can whisk that together, the only other thing you're going to really need is your flour. Now if you'd rather just use self-rising flour instead of adding the baking powder, that can work as well. But the main thing that you want to make sure of is that you have the right balance of leavening or rising agents in there, the yeast and the baking powder, to the amount of water and flour and everything that you're using. So again, I just used that 1 cup of water and just 1 package of yeast, and this is probably about a cup or so, maybe 1.5 cups of flour, not a lot of flour. And you can see that just by whisking that in, now this dough is already very nice and kind of warm to the touch, but it's a little bit, you can see it's just a little bit sticky. So what I'm going to do is just grab a little handful of flour, shake it over the top, and we're just going to lightly knead that dough. So you can also just dump it out. You can knead it in the bowl. I'm just going to dump it out so that you can. So I just am going to knead and then fold that in half, knead it again. Making bread of any kind is going to get your fingers a little bit goopy with some dough, which is totally fine. It's going to get flour on your shirt, totally fine. You don't want to knead that dough until it's hard. you just want to knead it until when you kind of form a ball, it's no longer sticking to your fingers, and when you press into it, it should kind of bounce back. So again, when we press into it, it kind of bounces back. That's what you want with that dough. So for a fry bread dough, I treat it just a little bit differently than I would a regular yeast rolls type of bread dough. What I'm going to do is wrap it in saran wrap and let it sit for about 30 to 45 minutes. So we're just going to wrap that in saran wrap, and then we are going to just let your nice dough sit. And again, it doesn't make a huge amount of dough, but you don't want to eat an enormous amount of fry bread unless you have a huge event. And then of course you want to make a lot of it. But for just one family or for a couple days, you like fry bread to be fresh. So you want to eat this within a day or two. You don't want it to just be sitting around for a long time. So we're going to just make a small batch, and we're going to come back to this in about 45 minutes. So I'm actually just going to set my dough that's wrapped in saran wrap in the sunlight because it's warm in the sunlight, and it will just kind of encourage that yeast to continue to be active and grow a little bit. So when you come back, it should kind of look something like this. However, it shouldn't have overflowed the saran wrap. I got busy, so I left it there for an hour instead of 45 minutes. So after 45 minutes or so, you're going to come back to your dough, and it might look like this. It might be kind of a little bit of a hot mess as far as having overflowed your saran wrap if you forgot about it. I actually left it for more like an hour because I got busy. But anyway, you're going to just kind of punch your dough down a little bit and then pinch off about, I don't know, kind of like a handful size a piece. I like to make my fry bread just kind of like a serving size type of size, and I always put a hole in the middle. You don't have to do that part if you don't want to. When I was growing up, when I was little, I remember my mom was saying that, you know, like, you have to put a hole in the middle because that helps the spirit escape or something. But I don't think that really is the reason. I think more it's when it rises in the frying pan, it's going to like kind of close together, and so it prevents it from being doughy in the center. It's my opinion of the purpose of the hole in the middle, but some people don't put a hole in the middle. So if you don't want to put a hole in the middle, honestly, it's totally up to you. So these are kind of thin. I'm just doing these by hand. I'm shaping them by hand because to roll them out and cut them, it just gives it kind of like a more rustic feel and look to do it by hand as opposed to trying to make them like perfect circles or whatever. And you'll see when it's all done kind of what that looks like. So I am going to heat up about a half an inch or so of oil. I want it to be nice and deep enough for at least the whole bottom half to submerge into there. And if it's deep enough for the whole thing to go into the oil, then that works as well. I'm only going to be frying these probably like 3 at a time or so, however many fit in the pan, with a little bit of room around them, because you really don't want to overcrowd these guys. So you start to heat up your oil while you're shaping these out. And again, this dough is going to rise a second time. Some of these pieces are bigger. I know that, you know, sometimes my kids are going to go for like the bigger pieces or whatever. I might want a little bit of a smaller piece. But once all of your units are shaped and kind of laid out, we're going to check the heat of your oil, and then we're going to get ready to cook these. So this is kind of what they look like when they're shaped and just ready to cook. And you're, again, just waiting on the oil to get hot. So to test your oil, you can use just a small piece of dough and just kind of drop it in there. See if the oil gets bubbly, and you can see that it's definitely ready to cook the fry bread. You want that little piece to kind of puff up. Of course, if it's too hot, it will brown too quickly. So you want to just kind of make sure it's cooking at the right speed, and then you're ready to go ahead and drop in your larger pieces of fry bread. So we're just going to kind of gather up a few of these pieces and bring them over to the frying pan and just drop them in. And again, that oil or grease should get nice and mad. You should hear it. And they should rise to the top. They're gonna look almost a little bit like donuts, but you can kind of see how the grease is bubbling through the center of the bread, and that's going to cook it all the way around evenly, as opposed to, like, if you don't add that hole, sometimes your dough can get a little bit doughy in the middle, especially if you're using yeast. So you're just gonna cook these. You can turn them. They cook pretty quickly, so you want to just kind of like peek at the bottoms. That is not ready to turn quite yet, but like when they're floating, they're going to get nice and brown underneath. So you want to make sure that you turn them before they get too dark brown. So you want like a nice medium brown. So I'm watching this one here as probably the first one that's going to be turned over because it's brown in the inside of that little middle part too. So it looks ready to flip, and these other two are not too far away. This one's a little smaller, so I'm going to flip it. Fry bread is just so delicious with a little bit of melted butter, which seems redundant because of the grease, but just a little butter on it, or some jam. Like kind of a traditional jam would be something like huckleberry jam, something that's kind of like a wild berry, an indigenous fruit. So these are just finishing up, and as soon as the other side is equally brown, we are going to just get a nice little towel. You can use paper towels, you can use a cloth towel if you don't want to have any waste, and just go ahead and pop those out onto the towel. And you can see that steam coming off the fry bread, and it is just so delicious. So you definitely have to try this recipe. It's going to make about 7 or 8 of these pieces, and they are like hand-sized pieces, so you can see they're nice and large. So my burner is, excuse the flour from my hands on the little knob, but it's on a little bit over a 5 for the oil for cooking these. You want to just, again, keep monitoring the temperature, make sure it's not too hot. You don't want these to get too brown or hard. Just want them to be nice and crisp on the outside and very soft on the inside, like a nice dinner roll almost on the inside of the bread, but a nice crispy fried exterior. Just listening to that oil bubble is just such a kind of comforting and happy sound. So I'm going to bite into this and just show you how tender it is and how delicious. So good. So I hope you enjoy the recipe. Let me know if you have any questions, as always. I think every culture has some type of a flatbread or a bread, you know, of some kind. And this is definitely just a very delicious one. Very good with butter, without butter. Definitely want to eat this bread warm. And so you can just microwave it for 10 seconds if it's the next day. But this is a favorite right out of the pan. So you can see that it's just very fluffy on the inside, and it should have just a nice basic flavor that you can pair with any kind of condiments like preserves, jam, jelly, honey butter. Just dip it in your soup. I mean, really, it's pretty versatile. It's a very flexible accompaniment to any meal.